Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining this webinar on California Forever. I'm Wendy Leung. I'm a media specialist for the Center for Biological Diversity, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. So many of you are here today because you've heard about California Forever. Maybe you want to learn a little bit more. Maybe you have some concerns, and we have a lot of concerns too. So today we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the impacts that a brand new city could have on our air quality, on water supply, and a lot of possible threats to our environment. Today, we have a panel of experts who are going to talk about those concerns and address a lot of the misinformation that's out there. Francis, Sophia, and Elizabeth, they've been keeping tabs on this project for some time now, and they're the center's experts on land use, environmental laws, and biodiversity in California. And I want to begin to talk a little bit about why we're having this webinar today. Why are we having it now? And I think it's important to think about these issues and ask the questions now before, the development, if it's ever approved or construction begins. It's just too late to talk about those mitigating those harmful consequences. So a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to do our best to answer your questions today. We've got a Q&A set up. You can ask your questions anytime during the webinar, but we're also going to set aside some time at the end to answer your questions. This webinar is being recorded. We're going to upload that to our YouTube page later on today, and then we'll also email it to you and email it to anyone who signed up for this webinar. That way you can watch it later. And then finally, we have a closed captioning function. It's the CC icon at the bottom of your screen, and you can access that if you'd like. So why is the center concerned or interested in a development like this in Solano County? Well, my colleagues and I are part of the Urban Wildlands program at the Center for Biological Diversity, and we focus on land use policies, and we focus on ways to improve them so they protect both communities and wildlife. And we do that by using science and the law to challenge destructive sprawl projects that are proposed. These are the most destructive projects that pave over open space and do a lot of damage to the environment. So first, I want to ask Francis to give us a bit of an overview of this project. Francis is one of our staff attorneys, and I wanted to ask her to talk a little bit about what's the latest, what is the environmental laws that compel the developers to do for something like this. We already know a little bit. We know that a group of billionaire investors have purchased some 55,000 acres of ag land to build a new city. Francis, tell us a little bit more about what you know.
Yeah, this story, it really started off as a mystery. In 2018, this new company popped up out of nowhere called Flannery Associates, and started buying all this land in Solano County, thousands of acres. They were offering above market rate. In East Solano County, a place that had not historically had a lot of real estate speculation. It was kind of confounding. And then in August 2023, the New York Times broke the story that Flannery Associates is, like Wendy said, a group of Silicon Valley billionaires. And the reason they were doing this was to build a new city from scratch, which I don't think anyone really guessed. But now we know a little bit more about their plans, and what the first stage of this development would be a land use change for 17,000 acres of land in East Solano County. 39 square miles changed from agricultural zoning to a new community. And so here you can see the one of the graphics they've put out showing where that would be. And then Cal Matters did this cool interactive thing where you could put the footprint of the new community over another part of California just to get a sense of the scale. So here I did San Francisco, and you can see it's like half the size of San Francisco. Their plan is that eventually they have hopes that it might be up to 400,000 residents. Which if that happened, it would be 3 times bigger than Vallejo, the size of Bakersfield. So you can really imagine how that would completely reshape Solano County to have this big, a city that size just in East Solano County. And their vision, I think the part of how it seems to them is that this is just empty, unused land. It's underutilized. There's not a lot going on here. They chose this spot. They chose this spot kind of in the middle of nowhere. And now they're hoping it can be just a blank canvas for their utopian vision. And the thing is, that's just not true. And we're going to talk throughout this webinar about all the ways that land isn't empty, and that land is very valuable in its current state. And when I first understood how incorrect that story of underutilized land was when I went to one of the town halls that Flannery Associates put on in Rio Vista. They were doing these town halls to kind of explain their vision and try to get some support. And I drove up there. It was the first time I'd been to Rio Vista. It was my first big exposure to this project. And I showed up at this this community building, and it was packed full. It was standing room only. I was in the very back, and it was just full of people who had really, really good questions for the developer. They had very, very specific concerns about how this would affect Travis and traffic and the schools, and you could just tell how deeply they care about this community in this area. Everybody would start their question with, my family's been here for 3 generations. I've farmed my whole career. I've worked in the schools for 20 years. It's just not true that there's not a lot going on there. There's really solid community and people who really care about this land and get a lot of value out of it as it is. So I'll talk a little bit about the laws that California has that can protect the land and protect all of the value that open space has. So the first step in this process is going to be a ballot measure to rezone. But after that, if the ballot measure passes, they'll have to go through the environmental review process. And what that means for a project of this size is that they're going to have to do an environmental impact report. An environmental impact report is a document that has to analyze and disclose all significant environmental impacts that the project might have, and mitigate the impacts as much as possible. So it has to have a plan for mitigation. And you can imagine, I've read a lot of environmental impact reports, and they're all really pretty huge and technical and dense, and they have appendices and they have studies, and it's a lot of information. And you can imagine for a whole new city to really understand the impact of that and try to mitigate it, that's going to be a huge undertaking to get all that information together. And they've made a really ambitious plan to start the EIR in 2025 and have it certified at the beginning of 2026. So we'll see how that goes. That document will give us a lot of information, and we'll see if it does what it needs to do in terms of really fully letting people know what the impacts will be and mitigating them, or if it doesn't do a good job. And the thing that I like to keep in mind about this project is building a new city from scratch is particularly dramatic. They want to present this as this visionary, unique, bold idea. But really, it isn't the first time we've dealt with something like this, because it's really just a classic sprawl development. And in the urban wildlands program, this is kind of our bread and butter. So these huge EIRs that I'm talking about, we review them all the time. And when there are problems with them and when they're not going to protect the environment the way that they need to, then we have a lot of tools we can use to address that through the California Environmental Quality Act. That's really what we're good at. So some examples of similar similar development proposals have come up in the past. Tejon Ranch was originally proposed to be a huge development outside of LA on some of the last, best, and largest native grassland and wildflower fields in California. And now the court has set aside those approvals after years and years of work from our litigators. Otay Village 14 was 1,000 acres of wildlands outside San Diego, and that land was critical wildlife habitat, and it was also high fire risk, so any development there was going to be dangerous. And through our work, thousands of acres are going to be preserved and protected. So that's the kind of experience and expertise that we bring to this, and we're going to have a lot of really powerful tools to bring to this fight. And speaking of, one of our most powerful tools is the allies that we work with. That community opposition that I was talking about earlier has coalesced into a coalition called Solano Together, which is a group of residents, ranchers, farmers, environmental groups, local leaders. It's a really diverse group, and the center has joined. We're a member, and I've been going to a lot of those meetings, and they're really great. It's a group of people who are really, really passionate and have a lot of deep connections in the community, and are just working really hard to get organized and get educated about this. So I really recommend, if you're interested in getting more involved, solanotogether.org would be a great way to plug in, and especially when if this initiative gets on the ballot in November, then obviously there's going to be a lot of work to do to get out the vote on that issue, and Solano Together will be a great place to plug in and get involved in that.
Great. Thank you, Frances. Thank you for letting us know about this really important coalition, Solano Together. I'm sure maybe some of you participating tonight is already part of Solano Together. That's great. There's the website right there and in the chat if you want to learn more. You know, some of what you were describing, Frances, about this land being viewed as undervalued, that is kind of a message that we hear a lot from developers. This is, you know, underutilized, dusty, barren land, and why not put homes there? And I wanted to bring up our staff scientist, Sophia, to talk a little bit about whether this description of the land is accurate. Sophia, what do you know about this property? And can you talk a little bit about why this land is important to Solano County?
Sure. Thank you, Wendy. I really appreciate the question. I'm excited to talk about one of my favorite things, which is biodiversity. To start with, I will say this characterization is simply not accurate. You may be, as folks who are interested in the environment, you might not be surprised to hear that. But one thing I will point out, so I'm showing a picture here of some of the California Forever owned land, is that most of this land is agriculture, as Frances was describing. And you won't get me saying that agricultural land is as good as intact native habitat, of course. But when we think about agricultural land in comparison to being paved over for ex-urban development, agricultural land has much more value for biodiversity. So I just wanted to point that out in the beginning. The land that California Forever owns contains lots of different types of diverse habitats that host lots of different species. So today I can just walk through a few of those habitat types and a few of the important species that live there. So we'll start out with grasslands and agricultural fields. Now, again, similar to what I just mentioned, grasslands and agriculture are definitely not synonymous. But in Solano County, a lot of agricultural fields do share similar functions to grasslands. And so I wanted to sort of group them together for this discussion, especially because a lot of the species that are present there are able to use agricultural fields and native grasslands. So that's an important point there. And before we even get into any of these species, I will say that agricultural fields do have a role in ecosystem processes. We might not consider them as important as intact native habitats, but they do play a role in, for example, carbon sequestration. Same with native grasslands. This is something that's actually underappreciated in many types of grasslands, but they store a lot of carbon, especially under the soil in their roots. They also play a role in the water cycle. Anywhere that there's vegetation, they have an impact on erosion and sort of helping prevent erosion. And then, of course, they provide lots of habitat for various different species. So let's take a look at our first one. And I'll just note before I continue here, on the top left of each of these slides, I'll show you the name of the species, the common name and the scientific name, their status, their sort of legal status in California and or according to federal law, and their primary threats. So the first species I have here is the Swainson's hawk, which is a very elegant, sort of medium-sized raptor. They are migratory. They're a really interesting species because they have this really huge migration. So they spend their breeding seasons, which is the summer, in Western North America, including California. And when their breeding season is over, they migrate all the way to South America. So you'll have individual hawks that are traveling from Argentina up to Solano County potentially every year. So it's a really impressive migration that the species undergoes. They are adapted to open grasslands in general. And of course, as native grasslands have declined across North America and across much of the world, in fact, a lot of those grasslands have been converted to agriculture, and the species has become increasingly dependent on agricultural landscapes. And this is especially true for foraging. So they do usually nest in trees, but they tend to nest in areas near very open habitats like agricultural fields, and that's where they do all their hunting and all of their foraging. This species was listed as threatened by the state of California in 1983, and that was due to decreasing population numbers that were observed by scientists. Unfortunately, they remain threatened today, so their status hasn't really improved, and they continue to be a species of concern, and one where it's really important to protect those remaining habitats that do exist, such as are present on the California Forever properties. As I mentioned here on the slide, their primary threats are habitat loss and degradation due to land conversion and development, and that's something you may see popping up several times for some of these species. So the next species is a very charismatic, very well-known one. If you've seen them, then count yourself lucky because they are extremely cute. These are the burrowing owls. They are very well named. They live in burrows, generally burrows that are created by rodents like prairie dogs. And they also occur in native grasslands, but they're able to use agricultural fields as well. Similar to Swainson's hawks, they forage in agricultural fields, but different from Swainson's hawks, they actually nest in agricultural areas as well, since they use some of those burrows of those mammals that are living in agricultural areas. They've also experienced significant habitat loss, since they do share similar habitats to the Swainson's hawk, but they can do relatively well in some of these modified open areas. They've also experienced significant declines in California, an estimated 60% population decline since the 1980s, which is very significant. Again, that's primarily due to land conversion, especially commercial and residential development. Many remaining populations are fragmented for this reason as well. And I will mention they are currently a California species of special concern, but the center actually just recently submitted a petition to get them onto either a threatened or endangered status according to the California Endangered Species Act. So hopefully we'll see that being successful, and then they'll get more legal protections. But even right now, they are a species that the state is monitoring, and that of course we're keeping a close eye on as well to try and protect them as much as we can. So that's just a couple species that live in grasslands. Of course, I could go on and on for hours and hours, but we don't have time for that. So I want to cover a couple other interesting habitats that are present as well. And the second of these is vernal pools. And vernal pools are a really unique habitat type that hosts a lot of very specialized species. So these are temporary wetlands. They form in depressions in the landscape, sort of these small swales and other sorts of depressions in the soil. And they often occur on clay soils because water gets trapped on top of the soil and isn't able to percolate. And so they form these pools that last for weeks to oftentimes months. And these temporary pools provide habitat for a lot of species that are specifically adapted to this sort of seasonal wetland. Many of the species that do occur in vernal pools are what we call endemics. So they are found basically nowhere else in the world. And this is true of several California vernal pool species in particular. So these pools are really important for local and regional biodiversity. And unfortunately, they're also really sensitive. So because this habitat type is so specific, it can be very limited. So especially in areas that have had lots of development in the past, what folks often don't realize is even if the pool isn't full, that is a vernal pool habitat. So they often get paved over and destroyed because folks don't really think that a seasonal wetland is important, but they're in fact extremely important to a lot of these species. They're really easily damaged by development and even unsustainable agricultural practices. The California Forever lands contain multiple important vernal pool areas. So Solano County actually has quite a few vernal pools relative to other areas of the state. And so any impact that this development might have on vernal pools could have a really large impact on the species that occupy them. And so I'll go over a couple of those special species here. One, which is one of my favorites, is of course the California tiger salamander. They're sort of a really great emblem of California's native biodiversity. These amphibians spend most of their adult lives underground. So they have a really interesting life cycle. Like many amphibians, I should say like all amphibians, they are biphasic. And we could go into the nuances of that biology, but again, I'll keep it a little more simple for now. Essentially, they have an aquatic larval phase and a terrestrial adult phase. So the adults spend most of their lives underwater in rodent burrows or other burrows. During the rainy season, they emerge from the ground and they go towards temporary pools, like especially vernal pools, to breed. And so the adults will spend some time in the vernal pools, they'll breed, and then they'll go back into their upland habitats. And so this is where that connection between the upland areas, these grassland areas with all these burrows, and the vernal pools is really important. So maintaining these diverse habitat types on a small scale is something that we really want to make sure happens as well. And so once the salamanders breed, the eggs will develop in the vernal pools, the larvae will hatch, and then they will metamorphose into terrestrial adults by the end of the vernal pool's existence. Essentially, as the vernal pool evaporates, the juveniles, which are now terrestrial, will be able to emerge and go out and find burrows of their own. So they have this just really interesting life cycle that connects these disparate habitats. So they're really fascinating. Unfortunately, the species is threatened once again, primarily by habitat loss and fragmentation. They are amphibians, so they are very sensitive to lots of other threats as well, including things like disease and pollution. But habitat loss is a really big one for them. And that is true of both the aquatic habitat and the upland habitat. So if either of those is lost, then that's really bad for that species. Oh, and sorry, before we move on, I should say they are both federally and state listed as threatened species. So there's something we were really concerned about maintaining in that habitat. The next species I want to highlight is the vernal pool tadpole shrimp. This is another federally listed species. These are an endangered species. You may be surprised to learn that these are crustaceans. So these are actually freshwater crustaceans that live only in vernal pool habitats, and they are only found in California. So this is one of those endemic species that I was mentioning earlier. The entire adult life cycle occurs in one season within a vernal pool. So the adults will emerge from eggs, they will mature, they will breed, and then they will die all in the course of this one temporary pool. What's really interesting about this species is that when they breed and they lay their eggs, those eggs can dry out and be totally fine. So the eggs will stay in the dry vernal pool areas once all that water is evaporated for potentially multiple years. So they're extremely well adapted to the drought-prone areas that they occur in California. Unfortunately, this does mean that they can be very affected by land use changes as well. So things like off-road vehicle use, things like unsustainable farming and unsustainable grazing practices can damage even those eggs that are present in the dry soil. So that makes them a pretty sensitive species. I am highlighting this one, but there are actually multiple vernal pool shrimps, vernal pool crustaceans that are also threatened. So this is just one example of the multiple species similar species that we can find in this really sensitive habitat type. Again, habitat loss and degradation and fragmentation are some of their main threats. Invasive species are also a really tough challenger for these guys. And I will note that invasive species often tend to follow humans. So anytime that there's extra disturbance, that can lead to more invasive species and more trouble for species such as this one. And the last vernal pool species that I'll highlight right now is these Contra Costa goldfields. So this is a federally listed endangered plant. I know a lot of us are really into animals, but plants are, of course, extremely important, extremely diverse, and play a really big role in all ecosystems, really, but especially in these vernal pool ecosystems as well. And these flowers are unfortunately having a really hard time. They were once widely distributed throughout the counties that surround San Francisco and the San Francisco Bay Area, but they've been reduced to only a few existing populations, 20 to 30 at the most. And so these are really, really limited. They've experienced extreme declines, and Solano County is one of the few areas that still have the species left. They experience lots of threats, including urbanization, habitat loss, non-native plants, and one that I'll point out that's especially important for them is altered hydrology. So, you know, it might not be super obvious, but of course, when we change things like water usage, when we change things like urbanization, that can change the water cycle in the surrounding areas, and that can have a really significant impact on lots of different species, but that's one that's really impacted this flower as well. Any sort of changes in the hydrology can have sort of cascading effects for them. So once again, this is one that is barely hanging on, and any impacts to the remaining populations could push it even that much closer to extinction. And now the last habitat type that I'll highlight for today, which of course is not the last habitat that occurs in the area, but is one of the bigger ones, is riparian areas, and essentially will bin it into other wetlands, things like marshes, streams, and that sort of thing. The California Forever Lands borders several of these sensitive wetland habitats, the biggest of which is the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta and the Sacramento River. And then there's also multiple marshes and sort of small streams throughout the properties as well. And of course, we don't have any specific details about what the development might look like. As Francis said, we're still in pretty early stages and we don't know exactly what they're going to build and where. But as we start to see some of those environmental review documents, we'll be able to understand how their water usage might be impacting some of these local areas. But what we do know is that the Delta is an extremely fragile ecosystem. Water conveyance from Northern California to Southern California, increased urbanization, changes in land use, increased pollutants, all of these things have led the Delta to be in a very precarious position. So lots of the species that were once there are really hard to find. Some of the ecosystem functioning appears to be a little bit, well, I shouldn't say a little bit, appears to be altered. And any changes that might further impede any of those ecosystem functions could have a really big impact, not just on the areas within the development itself, but also in these surrounding ecosystems. So a couple of species that might be impacted include, first of all, the western pond turtle. This is the only native freshwater turtle in California. It's been recently proposed for federal listing as threatened. And so if that goes through, then they will have some actual legal protections. Right now, it's a California species of special concern. These turtles occupy lots of different types of wetlands throughout California. So basically everything that I just mentioned, they could be found in rivers, streams, marshes, etc. But similar to the tiger salamander, they also rely on upland terrestrial habitat. So they spend most of their time in the water, but for nesting, females will come onto the land and dig nests and lay their eggs. And they do this oftentimes in the banks along waterways, but also in open fields, similar to what might be found in some of those California Forever Lands. Like many of the species I've been mentioning, habitat loss and fragmentation have led to some really negative impacts on the species. A lot of the populations have become really fragmented. And then altered hydrology, as I was saying, for the Contra Costa goldfields are also a really big issue for the western pond turtle as well. And the final species that I'll highlight for now is the Delta smelt. And this is a somewhat famous fish. It's been in several political debates, but essentially it's a symbol of the Delta's ecosystem health. So this is a very small fish. It was once one of the most common species found in the Delta, and today it's nearly impossible to find. They haven't been seen in many areas of the Delta for quite a while. So, and this has only occurred over the past maybe 40 to 50 years. So it's a really sharp decline in a species that was once common, becoming extremely, extremely rare. So it just goes to show that the Delta ecosystem is experiencing a lot of different stressors, and that's impacting a lot of the fish and other organisms that live within that ecosystem. For that reason, this fish is federally listed as a threatened species, and it's listed by the state as endangered. And some of its greatest threats are things like changes in the Delta water flows through water conveyance systems, water diversion leading to direct and indirect mortality, things like toxins and pollutants, all impact this fish. And so, as I mentioned before, if the California Forever development has any of these additional impacts on the Delta, that's also going to start pushing this, or continue to push this species and others like it even closer to extinction. So in conclusion, like I said, I could keep going on and on about the incredible biodiversity that exists in Solano County, but for now, what I will say is that these lands that are now owned by California Forever currently support lots of diverse ecosystems and diverse species within those ecosystems. And destroying and replacing these lands, replacing them with exurban development, as is proposed, will have irreversible impacts on the county's biodiversity.
That's super interesting. Thank you so much, Sophia. When I hear you speak about all these species, it makes me want to like go back in time and pay more attention in my science classes. I did not know that there was so much great biodiversity in Solano County. Some of these species, maybe we don't see them, we drive by and we don't see them, but that doesn't mean that they're not there. I wonder if there is a way to balance that. Could we protect species habitat and build housing? We are facing a affordable housing crisis in California, and I was wondering if Elizabeth could address that. She is a campaigner for the Urban Wildlands program, and she's also our land use expert. Elizabeth, what's wrong with addressing the housing crisis here in Solano County?
Thank you, Wendy. While it is true that California is facing an affordable housing crisis, sprawl development threatens our native species and harms community health by increasing air pollution and putting people at risk of wildfires and other environmental hazards. Additionally, as outlined in our recently released report, The True Cost of Sprawl, when we build sprawl, we pull public funds away from existing communities to support the expansion of infrastructure like roads, power lines, and water and sewage services. And this means there is less available to invest in much needed infrastructure maintenance, efficiency upgrades, and public services such as trains, buses, and other forms of sustainable transit in existing communities. Specifically, U.S. sprawl development increases per capita infrastructure costs by 50%. So while sprawl may be cheap for developers, ultimately the public pays a hefty price for these land use mistakes. And we need to prioritize solutions that put community and environmental health before private profit, and we need to act now. So what do those solutions look like? First and foremost, we need to permanently protect all remaining open space. As Sophia highlighted, loss of habitat is the #1 threat for species across the state, and we cannot afford to lose any more of our remaining open space to development. We also need to permanently protect all current affordable housing. This is an often overlooked issue, but many affordable housing units are lost every year simply because they term out. So most affordable units are only guaranteed for 30 to 50 years, leaving many residents stranded once those terms expire. This only exacerbates the affordable housing shortage, and thus we must protect existing units in perpetuity. Additionally, we must solidify legally binding anti-displacement policies. This is a very important first step because it ensures that current residents are guaranteed access to housing in their communities as the area gets denser and more investments are made in public resources. Once those protections are in place, the next step is to upzone urban infill areas, especially around public transit. This will allow for density increases in areas that already have public services, leading to more efficient and sustainable communities. However, just building more market rate housing in the urban core will not provide affordable options, which is the real need. Thus, 20% of all new units should be required to be affordable. These units should be built in areas free from toxic pollutants and other environmental hazards and not prone to flooding and wildfires. Lastly, these new units should be climate resilient, meaning they are built near public transit, they have rooftop solar, energy and water efficient appliances, and drought tolerant landscaping. These investments would allow us to provide the much needed housing for Californians that are currently struggling to afford this basic necessity, while ensuring that our native landscapes are protected and we continue to work towards meeting California's ambitious climate goals.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. I especially like the solutions that you offered. You know, oftentimes we hear from developers that what they want to build is sustainable communities, and often, you know, there's a lot of empty promises there. So I want to bring the conversation back to where we are today and what are some of the next steps. Francis, I heard you talk about the ballot initiative. I thought it would be good to maybe get into that just a little bit more. What's the latest on that? Because I think maybe some of the people here today have already seen some signature gatherers in the community. When will that be on the ballot?
Yeah, absolutely. So the reason they're working on a ballot initiative right now is that Solano County has something kind of unique, which is that in 1984, voters in Solano County passed the Orderly Growth Initiative. And what that does is it creates boundaries inside which urban growth is permitted and outside which it's not. And that creates land use patterns where you have cities surrounded by open space, agriculture, wildlife, all sorts of other uses that are only really possible when you limit urban development. So those are the kind of land use policies that prevent sprawl that we really like. And so because this project is sprawl, in order to build it, they're going to have to get modification to the Orderly Growth Initiative, which has to happen via a ballot initiative. So they've proposed this initiative. They had a couple false starts with writing it, but now they have a third version of the initiative that's been given an official title and summary from Solano County, which is what allows them to start collecting signatures. So they're now at the stage where they're ready to get those signatures. They need 13,000 to get on the ballot. And generally it's kind of expected in these situations that you can get those signatures if you have money to spend on the campaign, and definitely in the situation they do. So I think probably we're expecting that that will happen and that it'll be on the ballot. And what they're hoping for is November. That's their goal. And the deadline is August 8th for final approval to be on the November ballot. So on August 8th, we'll know for sure if they made their goal and if they're on the ballot in November. Like I said, it's likely that they will. And then at that point, that's when the get out the vote efforts will start on that. So like I said, that's a great time to get involved in those through Solano Together. And yes, they're currently gathering those signatures. So if you live in Solano County, you might be seeing that around at stores and everywhere. And that's why that's happening.
Yeah, and we'll be following all the developments on that and sharing that with you all. So I do want to open this up to your questions. If you thought of things to ask our experts, please type them into the Q&A. For those of you who have joined a little bit late, I said earlier that we are recording this webinar so that you can watch it later. I misspoke though. I said the recording would be uploaded tonight. It'll actually be ready by the end of the day tomorrow, and you'll be getting a follow-up email on Saturday with that link. So, let's see. I actually have a lot of follow-up questions hearing everybody's presentations, but I did want to open it up to the audience. We have one question from Denise. I don't know if this is something that Elizabeth wants to weigh in on legislation. Denise wants to know, what are the chances that we could get legislation passed or proposed even to prevent development on private property in open spaces based on biodiversity or ecosystem values? For now, only wildfire concerns seem to have any effect, however temporary. I know that the center has been successful in getting some legislation sponsored by us, but it probably depends on your lawmakers. What do you think, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I mean, I would just like to highlight some success areas here that we've had at the local level. Ventura County has a wildlife connectivity ordinance that we really see as a template for other jurisdictions. And that's been something that we've been promoting in other, other counties that we engage in. It's also something that we are currently working on at the state level. We have a bill that we're sponsoring, AB 1889, with Assemblymember Friedman's office. And that would require local jurisdictions to implement best practices around wildlife connectivity when they update their general plans. So I think there are definitely some pathways forward on that. I hear you that it is frustrating and definitely takes some time, and we're not, where we need to be. But the center is working very hard to try to enact those policies at both the local and state level.
Hearing Sophia, hearing your presentation about the wildlife, and it made me think about the water source. I think you mentioned that we don't really know right now where the water source will come from for this brand new city that could potentially have tens of thousands or maybe eventually hundreds of thousands of new residents. Is it concerning to you at this time to not know where the water is coming from?
Yes, absolutely. I would say, I think it should be concerning to anyone. It is California after all. Like, water is a limiting resource in many regions of the state. California Forever did try to engage in some talks with the county water agency, the Solano County Water Agency. But the agency decided to not continue those talks because it's simply too early. They haven't even shown any tangible plans. So, I think folks were concerned that they're trying to get water rights before we even know what the water is going to be used for. And they just haven't really provided any detail. They say we have water, we're going to have water, we're going to buy water, and we just don't really know where that's coming from. Anywhere that it's coming from, it's going to, it could be going somewhere else. So that's just a concern. We want to know, is this water really, is it spoken for by the environment, or should it have been spoken for by the environment? We're already seeing these reduced flows in the Delta and in surrounding areas, and anything that's drawing additional water from those sensitive habitats is going to have a detrimental impact. So it's something that I'm really worried about. It's something that we're definitely going to be keeping an eye on and keeping track of these, any of the regulatory processes that they have to engage in around water, and try and make sure that anything that they're claiming is something that they can actually back up and is something that's not going to have impacts on the environment and on native species.
A lot of people also have concerns about air quality, the prospect of a lot of residents moving in that are car dependent, that would have to drive quite a ways to their jobs or other locations. Elizabeth, what do you think about the impact on air quality for a development like this? Could new residents potentially rely on public transportation as a way to mitigate some of those concerns?
Well, currently it would take almost 3 hours to get from Solano County to the Bay Area via public transit versus only 1 hour in a car. So this pretty much guarantees that a majority of residents in this proposed development would be driving. And this increase in daily vehicle trips would result in toxic emissions of pollutants, which have a whole host of negative public health outcomes, including premature mortality, compromised birth outcomes, heart disease, and many respiratory illnesses. Additionally, this increase in vehicles miles traveled would exacerbate the climate crisis. In 2021, the emissions associated with U.S. passenger vehicles totaled 370 million metric tons of carbon dioxide, and California's annual average emissions associated with passenger vehicles between 2000 and 2020 was approximately 110 million metric tons of CO2. So both federal and state governments have set emission reduction goals, yet local governments continue to undermine those efforts by approving more sprawl development. Land use policies that incentivize infill affordable housing and efficient, reliable, and accessible public transit should be an essential component of any successful climate resiliency plan. And that discrepancy between what the state is claiming as a goal and the actual actions of local jurisdictions is a real problem.
And I know I've had a lot of questions for you, Francis, but just one other thing. I've heard some ramblings. I don't know, is this project already in court? Is there a lawsuit over this already? And is the center involved at all?
There is a lawsuit over this already. That's one of the difficult things about keeping track of all the things going on with this, is there are a lot of different moving parts. The lawsuit that's going on right now is a lawsuit. Flannery is suing some of the Solano County landowners, basically alleging that they were price fixing during the sale when Flannery wanted to buy their land. And those lawsuits have been really, really rough for those families, those farming families. Their legal fees have been intense. It's been it's hard, and that's a big part of that's a big issue that's causing a lot of bad blood between Flannery and the locals. We are not involved in that lawsuit because it's not a land use lawsuit. It's not the kind of law we do. It's just out of our wheelhouse, but we are supporting them as much as we can through the coalition. There's as part of the coalition, the coalition has started something called Solano Rural Defense, which is an organization that's specifically trying to raise money and find ways to support those families that are facing those legal fees. So I can send a link to that. But we're not involved with that, and it doesn't have anything to do with if the project will go forward. It's kind of just a tangential issue over how the land was acquired.
Okay. And Francis, we have a question from Mary. Do you know if the initiative does get on the ballot, if they get enough signatures and goes on the November ballot, would it just need a simple majority to win?
You know, that is a great question. That's a great question that reveals something very basic that I actually don't know. I assume it is a majority, and obviously, once it gets on the ballot, we'll go deeper into exactly what happens then. So I guess for now, I'll just say, great question. Thank you for asking. Thank you for helping me realize that I don't know the answer. But we'll look at that. Thanks.
I also think am leaning on simple majority, and Dwayne, one of the Solano Together allies, confirmed it. It's basically
Oh.
50% plus one needed to pass an initiative.
Great. Thank you, Dwayne. Dwayne knows what's up.
Dwayne's on it. Yes, earlier in the discussion, we talked about Solano Together. So fantastic coalition that's growing, and you can learn more about them at solanotogether.org. I think those are all the questions that we have. You know, we're always here. We can answer more questions via email if you'd like, but I just want to thank everyone for coming. You know, we have a website on this project, on the CBD website, a page just on California Forever, and we've got Francis and Sophia's contact information there if you want to learn more. And I just really appreciate everyone joining us on a weeknight when you could be doing other things, watching the State of the Union or doing something else. But you came here to learn about our work and learn about how we're keeping just very close tabs on this project. We're concerned, we're worried, but the great thing is we're in the company of all of you who really care about the environment and really care about the future of Solano County. So let's keep in touch and have a great night. Thanks for coming.